Greetings. We're going on an introspective journey tonight, inward into the enormous terrain of the mind rather than out into the far-off cosmos. We shall examine a molecule that is so ubiquitous and well known to billions of people worldwide that its existence is frequently overlooked. However, the very rhythm of human awareness and thought is changed by this small molecule, coffee, which also alters consciousness itself. Humans have been searching for this molecule in seeds, leaves, bark, and berries for thousands of years. They have made drinks with it that have driven artistic movements, revolutions, and civilizations, and radically altered our perception of time. Like shrines dedicated to this one drug, coffee shops litter the streets of cities. Caffeine is what millions of people start their days with instead of meals. They huddle around tables with hot mugs in anticipation of that well-known surge of vitality and clarity. However, what is truly taking place? What odd dialogue takes place between the 3 pounds of tissue behind your eyes and this molecule? How can something so insignificant alter mood, cognition, and alertness so significantly? Give yourself permission to ponder the unseen structure of your own mind as you become comfortable. Caffeine itself changes the brain that processes it. This same molecule shapes the consciousness that poses these questions. Understanding caffeine reveals a fundamental aspect of what it is to be human, including how we fight against exhaustion, pursue clarity, and have developed the ability to control our own awareness. So take a deep breath, let your mind relax, and let's start this inside excursion. The chemical that altered the course of history. Caffeine is a basic substance. When you distill it to its most basic form, it is classified as an alkaloid, an organic chemical in which nitrogen atoms are interwoven throughout its structure. 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine is its chemical name. However, something more poetic is hidden underneath that formality. It is among the earliest strategies used by nature to stay awake. Caffeine has been produced by plants for millions of years. Caffeine, which is produced independently by several species on various continents, is found repeatedly in the leaves of the coffee plant, the seeds of cacao, the stems of yerba mate, and the shoots of tea. Why? The response provides insight into the natural world. A pesticide is caffeine. It is a protective mechanism found in nature. When caffeine is consumed by insects, remarkable things occur. The chemical disrupts their nervous systems, resulting in either paralysis or death. Caffeine is a weapon for plants. It keeps predators away from the valuable leaves and seeds. However, humans who have much larger and more sophisticated neural systems have found that the same substance that repels insects really has the opposite effect on us. We become more awake, more attentive, and more alive rather than paralyzed or injured. Caffeine and human civilization have a long and extensive history together. Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee, where the berries grew wild on the slopes of mountains. According to legend, Kaldi, a goat herder, observed that his goats were unusually energized after consuming coffee berries. Regardless of its veracity, the story captures a significant event. People realized that this plant provided them with something they needed. By the 15th century, coffee had moved northward via Arabia. It was consumed during long nights of prayer and reflection by Sufi mystics and Arab scholars. They knew something fundamental. They were able to remain attentive, in the moment, and in touch with their spiritual practices thanks to caffeine. The Arabic word kaha, which may imply wine, is where the word coffee originates, indicating that the beverage was highly valued in their society. Ottoman traders brought coffee to Europe around the 17th century. It was brought to Italy by Venetian traders. It made its way to the Netherlands, France, and England. It ignited something in every location. Coffee houses are businesses that are solely focused on serving this beverage. and something amazing took place in those coffee shops. Culture changed. The coffee shop developed into a hub for intellectual exchange. Caffeine sharpened the minds of writers, philosophers, merchants, and artists, keeping them focused and attentive for far longer than their bodies could naturally support. Because everyone could sit and listen to the most brilliant minds of the day discuss ideas for the price of a cup, coffee shops in England were known as penny universities. They fostered the Enlightenment. Before coffee shops, most human thought took place in solitude. A student may struggle against sleepiness for hours on end, losing focus as exhaustion tugs at them. However, coffee shops and caffeine made thinking more social. It was sustained. In a single space, hundreds of people could congregate, all chemically maintained in a state of hypervigilance, exchanging ideas and building upon one another's thinking. Caffeine actually drove the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, and the emergence of contemporary science. Coffee, tea, and chocolate were consumed by the great thinkers of the time in order to stay focused and clear-headed throughout long work-days. Isaac, Newton, Voltaire, and Beethoven all used caffeine, but none of them would have understood the biochemistry involved. Parallel discoveries were being made all around the world. Tea has been drunk in China for thousands of years. However, tea drinking did not become popular or culturally significant until the 8th century. As tea rituals developed, the ingestion of this caffeinated leaf became a focal point of meditation. Indigenous peoples in the Americas have long employed cacao and yerba mate, both of which contain caffeine in daily life and rituals. Caffeine was one of the most globally recognized compounds by the 20th century. Tea and coffee were cultivated on several continents. Coca-Cola, a soft drink in bottles, introduced caffeine to the general public in 1886. Later, energy drinks appeared, providing portable, high-potency doses of caffeine. Caffeine is currently the most often ingested psychoactive drug worldwide. It is essential to billions of people. Every year, people drink hundreds of billions of cups of coffee. The market for caffeine is valued at tens of billions of dollars worldwide. However, we were ignorant of the true effects of caffeine for most of human history until the previous 2 centuries. It had an impact on us. Our lives were structured around it. The intake of caffeinated beverages became the foundation of entire industries and societal structures. However, until recently, the mechanism remained a mystery. A German scientist by the name of Friedrich Ferdinand Runge did not isolate caffeine until 1819. After removing it from coffee beans, he recognized it as a unique chemical molecule and gave it a name. Its purpose was not entirely understood by the world even at that time. The actual mechanism of caffeine's effects on the brain was discovered after over 150 years of research. And something that altered everything was found when scientists eventually figured out what was going on, when they charted the complex dance between this molecule and the brain machinery of consciousness. Energy is not produced by caffeine. By obstructing our sense of fatigue, the brain's exhaustion signal, it gives the appearance of increased vitality. You have to understand weariness before you can comprehend coffee. Additionally, you need to comprehend adenosine, a fantastic chemical, in order to comprehend fatigue. Your brain is a huge energy user. At repose, it consumes about 20% of your body's energy, although making up only 2% of your body's mass. Energy is needed for every thought you have, every memory you recall, and every perception you process. The molecule known as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the source of that energy. Almost every cell in your body contains this universal currency of biological energy. ATP is continuously broken down and regenerated while your brain functions. Although this procedure is extremely effective, it is not perpetually viable. Adenosine is a result of the breakdown of ATP as it is used up. Adenosine builds up in your brain with every second that goes by, every thought you have, and every second you are awake. One indication is adenosine. It's your brain telling you, "I've been working and I'm tired." It is essentially the voice of exhaustion communicating through chemistry. I need rest. Throughout the day, rising adenosine levels send out stronger signals that advise you to go to sleep. In your brain, adenosine molecules attach to receptors known as adenosine receptors. There are several varieties. There are 1, 2, 2B, and 3 receptors dispersed across various parts of the brain. Adenosine causes a series of consequences when it attaches to these receptors. Adenosine buildup results in what sleep scientists refer to as sleep pressure. It is a biological necessity that steadily increases over the day and forces you to sleep. Adenosine keeps building up, and the pressure gets worse if you remain awake in spite of it. Sleep pressure is so strong after a 24-hour sleep deprivation that many nearly lose consciousness. There are too many signals. Caffeine enters the picture at this point. Chemists refer to caffeine as an antagonist, more precisely, an adenosine antagonist. This indicates that it prevents adenosine from attaching itself to its receptors. Adenosine is not destroyed by it. Its elimination from the brain is not accelerated. It only puts an obstacle in the way of adenosine's signal reaching the receptors that it normally would. Consider it this way. Adenosine is a messenger who is attempting to convey to your consciousness that you should go to sleep since you are exhausted. Before the letter reaches its destination, caffeine, a postal worker, intercepts it and says it. You never get the message, but it's still there. There is a block on the signal. Caffeine doesn't really give you energy because of this. Both individuals consume the same amount of energy when comparing their real metabolic output when using coffee and when not. The amount of ATP your body can produce is not increased by caffeine. Chemical amplification does not improve mental clarity or muscle strength. Rather, it does something more nuanced and possibly more significant. Your brain is misinformed about how tired it is. Within minutes of consuming a cup of coffee, the caffeine starts to enter your bloodstream. Caffeine normally enters your brain between 15 and 45 minutes, while the precise timing varies depending on your metabolism, body weight, food intake, and other factors. It then starts attaching itself to adenosine receptors and preventing adenosine from doing its function. The signs of exhaustion abruptly stop. The signal that your brain is fatigued is no longer received. At least perceptually, the sleep pressure that was mounting dissolves. You feel awake. You feel alert. You have a sense of vitality. The weariness signal has just been muffled, even if your brain is still as worn out as it was before. This is the reason that excessive usage of caffeine may be so harmful. It enables you to ignore one of the most crucial signals from your body. It enables you to remain up much later than is appropriate for sleeping. It enables you to disregard the precise system that developed to maintain your health by making sure you get enough sleep. However, it also explains the high value of caffeine. Blocking fatigue signals can be actually helpful in certain situations. This is especially true when you need to stay alert during long trips or have important tasks to complete. When you truly need to put off sleeping during situations that require prolonged attentiveness. There is a purpose for caffeine. When you need to be awake, it enables you to stay awake. Realizing that this is what is truly taking place is crucial. You're not getting any more energy. Your body's error-checking system is being sacrificed. Your brain is attempting to warn you that it is tired, but you are refusing to listen. The geography of caffeine sensitivity in the brain. Not every part of the brain is affected by caffeine in the same way. Instead of being a single structure, The brain is made up of many different structures, each with its own chemistry, function, and population of adenosine receptors. Caffeine's effects go through the brain in a variety of intricate and occasionally surprising ways because of this diversity. Think about the prefrontal cortex, which is located directly behind your forehead at the very front of your brain. This is where executive function is located. Decision-making, impulse control, future planning, and consequence analysis all take place there. There are several adenosine receptors, especially one receptor in the prefrontal cortex. These receptors become more active during the course of a long day as adenosine accumulates, which makes the prefrontal cortex sluggish. The quality of your executive function declines. Making decisions gets more difficult. You become more impetuous, more likely to cut corners, and more inclined to prioritize short-term gains above long-term gains. Such adenosine receptors are blocked by caffeine. Prefrontal function is restored. This explains why you feel more alert after drinking coffee. Your decisions become more thoughtful and your thoughts clearer as a result. Your brain's executive center is no longer constantly alerted to shut down. However, this is only a portion of the narrative. Caffeine blocks distinct adenosine receptors in the brain, which results in varied effects. Caffeine increases motor activity and motivation by blocking two receptors in the striatum, a deep brain area involved in movement and motivation. You feel more attentive, but that's not all. You have increased motivation to move, act, and complete tasks. Blocking adenosine signaling increases activity in the locus coeruleus, a small area in your brainstem with only 3,000 neurons, far less than many other brain regions. Norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter linked to arousal and attention, is produced in this area. Caffeine sharpens attention by making the locus coeruleus fire more easily. The world becomes clear. Distractions become less noticeable. Caffeine also affects the amygdala, the alarm area of your brain that deals with fear and emotional danger. The normal accumulation of adenosine reduces the amygdala's reactivity. You become less agitated and anxious. The design of nature includes this. You are less likely to see dangers and to panic when you are exhausted. Your brain is getting ready to sleep. However, this dampening effect is blocked by caffeine. It keeps your amygdala more active, which increases your sensitivity to possible threats and susceptibility to worry. For this reason, coffee can occasionally cause jitters or anxiety. It is keeping your threat-detecting system from naturally dampening, not making you anxious for no reason. Caffeine can make a stressful situation worse if you are already under stress. Caffeine might exacerbate anxiety if you already have it. There is no discrimination in the content. It inhibits all of the brain's tiredness signals, including those that would typically control negative emotions. Adenosine receptors are also found in the hippocampus, which is essential for memory formation. The hippocampus's ability to transform events into long-term memories declines as adenosine builds up. This is an additional way that weariness functions. You do not create memories as effectively when you are tired. It is a reordering of priorities in preparation for sleep. However, coffee counteracts this action, preserving the hippocampus's ability to encode memories. You can stay awake during a lengthy study session or business meeting and still retain the knowledge you have gained, even if you are weary. Caffeine is frequently used by students for this reason. Caffeine keeps them up, but that's not all. The reason for this is that caffeine specifically maintains the hippocampus's capacity to encode memories, enabling learning to continue even in the face of physical exhaustion. As adenosine builds up, the cerebellum that controls balance and coordination also loses accuracy. This is a component of fatigue's overall impact on motor control. However, coffee also blocks adenosine there, restoring this precision. For this reason, caffeine is frequently used by drivers, athletes, and pilots. Even when fatigued, it retains coordination and motor accuracy. Something significant emerges from comprehending this geography of caffeine's effects. There isn't any effect of caffeine. It has dozens of impacts that happen all at once in various parts of the brain. In reality, the effects of caffeine are a complex symphony of simultaneous alterations in prefrontal function, motor arousal, attention, emotional processing, and memory formation. This explains why the effects of caffeine differ so greatly from person to person. Differences in brain chemistry, genetic variances in adenosine receptors, and changes in the rate at which caffeine is metabolized. Each of these factors influences how sensitive a person is to caffeine. Caffeine can be focusing and energizing for some people. Others find it destabilizing and anxiety-inducing. At 8 p.m., some people are able to drink coffee and go to sleep by 1 o'clock. Some people discover that having just 1 cup of coffee at lunch keeps them from falling asleep that night. These variations do not imply that one individual is using caffeine in a proper manner, while another is not. It merely illustrates the fact that there are differences among human brains. Depending on each brain's distinct neuronal architecture, the same chemical can produce a variety of results. The interaction between dopamine and caffeine. When the sun travels over the heavens, human consciousness seeks out stimulation as the years go by and the seasons change. We are attracted to new things, thrills, and fulfilling experiences. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that provides this drive. Contrary to what popular science frequently claims, it is not the pleasure chemical. That description is far too simplistic. Dopamine is more correctly described as the motivation molecule, the attention chemical, and the salience chemical. It is what makes things feel essential, what pushes us to seek goals, and what makes us notice certain things and disregard others. Caffeine and dopamine have a modest but important link. Caffeine has secondary effects all across the brain, but its main action is to block adenosine. Dopamine signaling is involved in one of these. When adenosine is not being blocked by coffee, it works on adenosine receptors across the brain's dopamine system. One crucial place is in the nucleus accumbens, a structure deep in the brain that is central to reward processing and motivation. When adenosine accumulates up there, it reduces dopamine signaling. Your brain loses desire and motivation as you get weary. Normally exciting things become less fascinating. The system of rewards down-regulates. However, this inhibition is removed when coffee inhibits adenosine in the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine signaling gets stronger. The world gets more engaging, more gratifying, and more salient. Things that were boring become interesting. Boring tasks suddenly become worthwhile. This explains why coffee and enjoyment go hand in hand so frequently. Coffee is not only consumed by people to stay alert. They consume it because they enjoy the taste of coffee. It's rewarding because of the ritual, the cup's warmth, the aroma, the taste, and the social setting. Additionally, caffeine increases dopamine transmission, which intensifies this reward and adds value to the experience. However, this is also where the seeds of dependency can sprout. The brain starts to expect that reward when it consistently results in an increase in dopamine signaling. You begin to yearn for it. The connection between the anticipation of dopamine release and the appearance of a coffee cup is strengthened. Your brain eventually rearranges itself to accommodate that expectation. Things feel less satisfying without the coffee and the dopamine rush. Life appears more boring, uninspired, and uninteresting. This is not the same as an addiction to cocaine or heroin. Although caffeine is a real type of psychological dependence, it does not cause the same level of dopamine dysregulation or physical reliance as those narcotics. The reward system in your brain has been rewired to anticipate caffeine. When caffeine is removed, the world momentarily loses its appeal, motivation, and engagement. This implies that caffeine may have a self-reinforcing effect on dopamine. Your brain starts to rewire itself around coffee the more you use it. Caffeine's dopamine surge becomes the new standard for what is deemed rewarding. Comparatively speaking, non-caffeinated activities seem more and more boring. For this reason, chronic caffeine users frequently claim that stopping the drug shows how reliant they have gotten. Nothing feels as interesting without it. However, it is worthwhile to investigate a different aspect of the connection between dopamine and caffeine. Similar to how caffeine affects adenosine, its effects on dopamine change depending on the part of the brain and the kind of dopamine receptor. Caffeine boosts dopamine signaling in some areas. In others, the consequences are more intricate or perhaps unexpected. For example, there is a specific link between dopamine and the prefrontal cortex that is essential for executive function. Maximum dopamine signaling is not necessary for optimal prefrontal function. Rather, an inverted U-shaped curve is seen. The prefrontal brain is slow and unfocused, and there is insufficient dopamine. The prefrontal brain becomes impulsive and disorganized when dopamine levels are too high. The center is the sweet spot. This relates to arousal in general and is known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. Every work has an ideal level of arousal, and too much is just as detrimental as too little. This indicates that in certain circumstances, coffee may potentially impair prefrontal function. Caffeine can induce an excessive dopamine state, which impairs attention and increases impulsivity. If you are already in a state of high arousal, alertness, focus, and adequate prefrontal dopamine signaling. This explains why some people claim that drinking too much coffee causes them to become disorganized rather than concentrated. The barrier between optimal and excessive arousal has been passed. Caffeine, adenosine, and dopamine interact to produce a complex web of effects that change not just from person to person, but also within the same individual's brain from one moment to the next. Your current level of arousal, your level of weariness, the amount of caffeine you've just consumed, your genetics, the time of day, your emotional state, and many other things all influence how you react to caffeine. Caffeine, your internal clock, and the circadian dance. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is a structure located deep within the brain, directly above the intersection of the optic nerves. Despite having only 20,000 neurons, it has a huge impact on human physiology and consciousness. Your brain's main clock is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Your circadian rhythm is the roughly 24-hour biological cycle that controls hormone secretion, appetite, body temperature, sleep and wakefulness, and hundreds of other physiological functions. For the most part, the suprachiasmatic nucleus functions without conscious control. Your body would still go through phases of waking and sleeping approximately every 24 hours, even if you were alone in a pitch-black room without any means of telling the time. There is some imprecision in this internal clock. The circadian rhythm of the majority of people is a little bit longer than 24 hours, usually 24. However, it offers the basic framework of human temporality between 5 and 25 hours. The main factor that synchronizes the circadian clock with the real 24-hour day is light. The suprachiasmatic nucleus receives signals from light hitting the retina in the morning, which essentially resets the clock and signals it is morning. Cortisol and other hormones that encourage wakefulness are then released. It inhibits the hormone that encourages sleep, melatonin. Sleep pressure increases during the day as adenosine builds up. However, your body is also receiving signals from the circadian clock to remain awake until the evening. A dramatic change takes place as the light fades around dusk. The the signal that darkness is approaching is received by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It lowers the output of signals that promote wakefulness. It boosts sleep-promoting signals output. Levels of melatonin increase. Your body temperature slightly decreases. Your metabolism slows down. This small group of neurons in the middle of your brain is coordinating every aspect of your physiology to get you ready for sleep. From a circadian perspective, this is where caffeine gets most intriguing. The circadian rhythm is not immediately disrupted by caffeine. The suprachiasmatic nucleus continues to generate its rhythm regardless of coffee use, but by inhibiting adenosine receptors throughout the brain. At least temporarily, caffeine can interfere with the circadian rhythms that encourage sleep. If you drink coffee in the afternoon, it prevents the adenosine that would normally be building up and warning your body to prepare for sleep. Even when the circadian clock is delivering increasingly strong signals that it is time to wind down, coffee is blocking the complementary adenosine signal from strengthening that message. Your body receives confusing signals. The circadian clock indicates it is evening. Prepare for sleep. The adenosine blockade indicates you are not fatigued. For a few hours, the adenosine blockade can override the circadian signals, but there is only so much coffee in your system, and it eventually gets metabolized. As coffee wears off, adenosine is no longer suppressed, and it suddenly pours back in, generating a phenomenon experts call the caffeine crash. But by this time, the circadian window for sleep may have passed. It is often about 10 or 11 ppm. When caffeine from afternoon consumption eventually wears off, your circadian clock, already confused by the disturbance earlier, may not be sending strong sleep signals anymore. This can create a vicious loop. You stay up later because afternoon caffeine prevents you from falling asleep at the regular circadian time. Your sleep is more sporadic or shorter. The next morning, you're exhausted. You increase your coffee intake to fight off this fatigue. Once more, caffeine throws off your circadian cycle. The rhythm gets more and more warped each night. For this reason, sleep hygienists advise against consuming coffee after 2 or 3:30 p.m., although it can range from 3 to 7 hours based on individual characteristics, including age, pregnancy, liver function, and genetic differences in caffeine metabolizing enzymes. The half-life of caffeine, or the amount of time it takes for your body to eliminate half of it, is normally 5 to 6 hours in most individuals. At 3 p.m., a cup of coffee was drunk. Indicates that 9 p.m., you still have half of it in your system. 3 a.m., only a fraction of it is left. For sensitive people, even this small amount may be sufficient to keep them from falling asleep. However, something more intriguing is taking place here. Humans did not evolve to use caffeine for reasons other than basic pharmacology. In a world without caffeinated drinks, our circadian rhythms developed. When coffee disturbs the circadian rhythm night after night, it generates a state of chronic circadian misalignment. Your body is receiving one message from your internal clock. However, it is receiving a different message from your caffeine-masked adenosine signaling. This ongoing imbalance has actual repercussions over time. Circadian rhythm disruption for an extended period of time is linked to a higher risk of mood disorders, cardiovascular illness, metabolic disorders, and cognitive decline. They are linked to heightened inflammation in all parts of the body. They interfere with the regular cycles of cellular repair, hormone release, and nutrition absorption. The circadian rhythm is a vital physiological function, not a luxury. It is essential to health. When coffee continuously interrupts the circadian rhythm, it kicks off a cascade of downstream consequences. For this reason, compared to day workers, night shift workers who depend on caffeine to stay awake during the workday have a higher incidence of health issues. This explains why teens who take caffeine to keep awake and enter high school sooner than they normally do report higher mental health problems. Caffeine is addressing the short-term issue of wakefulness, but by interfering with the circadian rhythm, it is causing more serious issues. The way caffeine interacts with circadian rhythms also exhibits an intriguing asymmetry. When it comes to avoiding sleep in the evening, caffeine works far better than when it comes to encouraging wakefulness in the morning. This is because wakefulness is already strongly signaled by the circadian clock in the morning. Although caffeine strengthens this signal, it does not carry out the main function. It is evening according to the circadian clock, but the circadian rhythm is providing strong signals that encourage sleep. By inhibiting adenosine, caffeine directly counteracts these signals. Caffeine's ability to inhibit adenosine and the circadian rhythm are at odds with one another. Additionally, the adenosine blockade frequently prevails, at least momentarily. This explains why coffee in the morning seems to promote natural wakefulness, while coffee in the evening seems to be working against your biology. However, caffeine exerts circadian effects, even in the morning. If you drink caffeine every single morning, your body begins to anticipate it. The timing of regular caffeine usage actually causes a minor shift in the phase of your circadian clock. Caffeine is learned to arrive at 7 a.m. Adjust the circadian rhythm accordingly. Then, one weekend, you don't have your regular 7 a.m. and sleep in late. Coffee use may cause odd circadian effects, lightheadedness, confusion, and a feeling that your body is not in sync with the outside world. The reason for this is that the expectation of morning caffeine caused a phase change in your circadian clock, which was then broken. The chemistry of addiction. The term caffeine addiction is fraught with meanings. Many individuals react skeptically when they hear it used in reference to caffeine. Unlike heroin or methamphetamine, which have serious negative effects on one's health and social life, caffeine is legal, freely accessible, and socially acceptable. These differences are also legitimate. Addiction to caffeine is not the same as addiction to heroin. However, this does not imply that the underlying mechanisms are completely different. Actually, knowing how coffee affects the brain's adaptive systems offers an intriguing glimpse into the process of neuroadaptation. Your brain reacts appropriately to the adenosine blockage of coffee by altering wakefulness, alertness, and dopamine signaling when you first experience it. However, your brain is dynamic. It continuously adjusts to its surroundings. When the brain becomes more receptive to a stimulus, this adaptation process is known as sensitization. When it becomes less receptive, it is known as desensitization or tolerance. After a few days of consistent caffeine use, a process of tolerance usually emerges. You discover that the effects of your morning coffee have diminished from when you initially drank it. Though not as vigilant as you once were, you nevertheless feel alert. This isn't because your metabolism has changed or because you've stopped absorbing caffeine. Your brain has adjusted as a result. Changes in adenosine receptor density and sensitivity are the main mechanisms of caffeine tolerance. Your brain responds to frequent exposure to coffee, which inhibits adenosine receptors by creating more of them. We refer to this as upregulation. Even when coffee blocks certain receptors, your brain is still trying to maintain its regular level of adenosine transmission. The brain's ongoing effort to preserve internal balance is known as homeostasis, and this upregulation is one type of it. When caffeine blocks adenosine, the brain makes additional receptors to make up for the blockage and allow adenosine to still signal. Although it is a sophisticated system, there is a cost. For the same effect, more caffeine is required. This phenomenon, known as tolerance, explains why chronic caffeine users frequently discover that they require increasing dosages to achieve the same results. After just 1 cup of coffee, Someone who has never had coffee before may feel noticeably more alert. After consuming caffeine on a daily basis for months, people may require 2 or 3 cups to experience the same level of alertness. Tolerance, however, is not the end. The alterations in your brain are more profound. Chronic caffeine usage causes more than merely an increase in receptors. They also become less sensitive. Desensitization occurs in certain adenosine receptors. Even when adenosine binds to them, their reaction is less intense. Another compensating mechanism is this one. In spite of persistent adenosine antagonism, the brain is attempting to preserve normal functioning. Genes linked to adenosine signaling also exhibit altered expression. Chronic coffee consumption causes your brain to produce more adenosine. Even though coffee is inhibiting the weariness signal, you are still making more of it. Another indication of homeostatic adaptation is this. By merely creating more adenosine, your brain is attempting to overcome the adenosine blockade. What occurs when you quit using caffeine as a result of these brain changes? Retraction. This has happened to many people. If you abruptly quit using caffeine after days or weeks of daily use, you will feel significantly worse than you did before you began using it. You're tired, groggy, and unable to focus. You may have mood swings, body aches, and headaches. Now, the cause is obvious. Your brain is used to being blocked off from adenosine all the time. Adenosine receptors have been elevated, resulting in increased adenosine production and decreased sensitivity to adenosine signaling. Your brain produces a lot of adenosine, which pours into all of these receptors that are now oversensitized to adenosine when caffeine is abruptly stopped. The signal is very strong. After being accustomed to suppressing it, your brain is now receiving a tremendous dosage of the weariness signal. For this reason, even if caffeine withdrawal is not harmful to health, it can be quite uncomfortable. It is not the same as opioid withdrawal, which can result in organ failure and convulsions. However, it is real. As your brain progressively acclimates to an environment devoid of caffeine, the discomfort may persist for days or weeks. It's interesting to note that different people develop tolerance to caffeine to varying degrees and at different rates. Variations in genetics are involved. Some people metabolize caffeine quickly due to genetic variances. They are less impacted by tolerance and have a faster rate of caffeine breakdown. Some people have slower metabolisms, which makes it easier for them to build up tolerance to coffee. Individual differences exist in the genes encoding adenosine receptors as well. Adenosine receptors in certain individuals are inherently more or less sensitive to adenosine and adenosine antagonists, such as coffee. Some people are predisposed to greater caffeine sensitivity, while others are predisposed to reduced caffeine sensitivity due to this variance, which manifests early in life. Some people can consume coffee all day and sleep well at night, which can be explained by these hereditary characteristics. Others discover that even 1 cup of coffee significantly impairs their ability to sleep. Additionally, the tolerance to caffeine that forms is not full. Complete tolerance, in which caffeine has no effect at all, never develops. Though it lessens with use, there is always an effect, regardless of dosage. Caffeine differs from some other medications in that its partial tolerance prevents tolerance from getting so bad that doses can become dangerously high. We can learn a lot about how the brain functions from the development of caffeine tolerance and the feeling of caffeine withdrawal. It is a dynamic system that is always changing to preserve homeostasis rather than a fixed one. Adaptive responses are triggered by any chemical stimulus. The brain circuitry is shaped by every stimulus. We actively participate in a tango between internal brain adaptation and external chemicals, rather than being passive recipients of pharmacological effects. The impact of focus. How caffeine alters your focus. The idea of attention deficit disorder did not exist in antiquity. Individuals were not required to concentrate on a single task for 8 hours straight. The speed of life was different. Weather and daylight frequently halted work, which was seasonal. Only a small elite practiced reading and writing, which were uncommon abilities. Compared to modern life, the demands on continuous attention were substantially different. We have created a world today that requires previously unheard-of levels of sustained, concentrated attention. With computers, you must spend hours at a time sitting still and staring at a screen while completing complex cognitive tasks. Children are expected by school systems to sit quietly and learn for whole days. Despite frequent internet distractions, office workers need to stay focused on their projects. In many ways, the contemporary environment tests one's ability to pay attention. Because caffeine immediately improves attentional capacity, it has become indispensable in today's world. However, comprehending attention itself, what it is, how it functions, and where it falls short, is necessary to comprehend how it accomplishes this. Attention is a group of interconnected processes rather than a single function. The capacity to concentrate on one thing while disregarding others is known as selective attention. The capacity to stay focused on one task for an extended period of time is known as sustained attention. The capacity to divide attention across several tasks is known as divided attention. Additionally, there is orienting attention, which is the capacity to quickly change focus in response to shifting demands from the environment or priorities. Particular brain networks and neurotransmitters are involved in each of these attentional activities. Attention is directed by the frontal parietal control network, which includes the prefrontal and posterior parietal brain. When something unexpected occurs, the temporal parietal junction and ventral prefrontal cortex work together to produce the ventral attention network, which aids in identifying important information and refocusing attention. When you are attending to something, the default mode network that is active when you are not focused on outside tasks is silenced. These networks all use a variety of neurotransmitters to communicate: GABA, glutamate, acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Attention is influenced by adenosine, which we have already covered in relation to fatigue. Adenosine receptors in the frontal and ventral attention networks become more active as adenosine builds up with weariness. This prevents certain networks from working. Your capacity to maintain focus deteriorates. Your thoughts stray. Things that would typically be easy to ignore divert your attention. These attention networks return to normal when caffeine blocks adenosine. The inhibition is removed. The networks have a stronger ability to fire. You develop the ability to focus, pay attention, and steer your attention toward a goal while avoiding distractions. However, caffeine's impact on focus extends beyond merely suppressing signs of exhaustion. Additionally, caffeine affects the attention-related dopamine and norepinephrine systems. Caffeine enhances dopamine signaling by inhibiting adenosine in the nucleus accumbens and associated reward areas. The task you are concentrating on becomes more salient as a result of this elevated dopamine. It gives the task a greater sense of significance, interest, and value. Activities that may otherwise seem boring become more engaging. You get more motivated to concentrate. Similarly, caffeine increases arousal and attentional ability via influencing the locus coeruleus, which produces norepinephrine. Maintaining an ideal state of awareness and identifying significant environmental information are functions of the norepinephrine system. You are more aware of your task and any potentially crucial information associated with it when your norepinephrine signaling is elevated. A condition that is subjectively seen as focus is produced by the combination of these effects. which include suppressing fatigue signals in attention networks, raising dopamine and raising norepinephrine. Time seems to move differently. The world seems smaller, and distractions disappear. You are in the flow that Mihai received from Mihi Csikszentmihalyi, a condition of maximum involvement in which ability meets difficulty and action happens instinctively. For this reason, students drink coffee while studying. For this reason, authors sip coffee prior to writing. Programmers surround themselves with empty coffee cups for this reason. The drug actually improves the attentional ability required for these challenging mental tasks. It is more than a habit or a placebo. There are actual neurochemical alterations that facilitate improved concentration. But there is a fundamental contradiction between coffee and focus. Caffeine improves attentional capacity generally, but under some circumstances, it can also cause attentional fragmentation. You may feel as though your attention is dispersed if you take too much caffeine, are already under a lot of stress, or if adenosine blockade goes too far into arousal. You are distracted by everything, but you are aware of everything. Your neurological system is overactive, which prevents you from focusing. This is related to the inverted U-shaped link between performance and arousal. For every endeavor, there is an ideal amount of arousal. You can't concentrate if your arousal is too low. You can't concentrate if you're too aroused. According to the inverted U relationship, more isn't necessarily preferable. This explains why caffeine's attention-boosting effects vary greatly depending on the situation. Caffeine is incredibly beneficial for a sleep-deprived student attempting to study late at night. It brings back the functional level of attentional capacity. Caffeine may push someone above their ideal level of focus and concentration if they are already well-rested, concentrated, and in an optimal arousal state. Daniel Kahneman, a neurologist, identified two ways of thinking. System 1 is quick and automatic, while System 2 is sluggish and intentional. System 1 needs little care. It is what activates while you are performing a routine or familiar task. System 2 needs constant, concentrated attention. It is what you utilize when you are making a big decision, learning something new, or figuring out a challenging situation. The main effect of caffeine is to improve System 2 thinking. It improves your ability to think intentionally, intently, and actively. But in some cases, there is a price for this. You can't participate as well while you're high on caffeine and heightened excitement. When System 1 thinking would typically be helpful, it is used. You become more methodical and cautious, but occasionally you also lose your fluidity and intuition. For this reason, creative people occasionally claim that too much caffeine limits their ability to be creative. A frame of mind that is attentive but not excessively focused and involved but not strictly goal-directed is frequently necessary for creativity. Here, too, the inverted U relationship is evident. By raising dopamine levels in the frontal striatal networks involved in creative cognition, moderate coffee consumption improves creativity. However, too much caffeine might raise arousal too much, which limits the adaptable associative thinking needed for creativity. There is a temporal component to caffeine's influence on attention as well. Depending on how long it is in your system, caffeine does not always improve attentiveness. Caffeine usually has the biggest influence on attention when its levels are rising within the first 30 to 90 minutes after consumption. Your ability to concentrate and focus is at its peak. The attentional effect likewise reaches a plateau as caffeine levels first plateau and then start to decrease. The attentional boost is gone by the time caffeine is thoroughly digested. For this reason, instead of having a big cup of coffee in the morning, many individuals drink many cups throughout the day. They are able to surf successive waves of peak caffeine concentration because of their drinking pattern. Every wave offers a new window for improved attention. However, this pattern also implies that adenosine receptors are blocked continuously throughout the day, which keeps adenosine from building up and indicating exhaustion. Some frequent caffeine users report an intriguing phenomenon. After months or years of daily caffeine usage, they find it difficult to concentrate without it, even on tasks they were able to focus on before starting to use caffeine. This implies that long-term alterations in attention networks could result from persistent caffeine usage. The absence of caffeine impairs attention more than if the person had never used caffeine in the first place, because the brain adjusts to long-term adenosine blockade. This is a warning on caffeine consumption. It is more than just a cognitive function enhancer. This medication alters your brain's natural ability to focus. Long-term use does increase genuine attention, but it also makes you reliant on the increase. When you stop taking caffeine, you'll find that your attentional capacity is lower than it was before you began using it frequently. The contradictory effects of caffeine and the significance of individual variability. The fact that caffeine has varying effects on various people is among its most intriguing features. This has nothing to do with anticipation or belief. It's not a placebo. It has true biological roots. Genetics is the cause of some of the most significant disparities, significant differences in the way individuals process caffeine. CYP1A2 is the main enzyme in charge of the metabolism of caffeine. About 95% of the caffeine you ingest is broken down by this enzyme, which is produced by your liver. Other enzymes break down the remaining 5%, which is ultimately eliminated unaltered. Different forms of CYP1A2 with varying rates of activity are produced by genetic polymorphisms in the gene encoding the enzyme. Some people have an enzyme that metabolizes quickly. Caffeine is rapidly broken down by them and does not build up in their system. Caffeine has a much shorter half-life for these quick metabolizers, maybe 3 to 4 hours. They experience the impacts quickly yet acutely. A slower metabolizing form of the enzyme is present in other people. In their system, caffeine builds up and takes a lot longer to eliminate. Caffeine may have a half-life of 7 to 10 hours, or even longer for these slow metabolizers. They experience the impacts more strongly and for a longer period of time. There are significant practical ramifications to this genetic difference. At 3 p.m., a quick metabolizer would be sipping coffee, might cause only minor disruptions to sleep. That same cup of coffee could keep a sluggish metabolizer awake that night. Caffeine is not being misused by any party. Their biology is just different. Slow metabolizers benefit more from caffeine's alerting effects, but also suffer more negative consequences, such as anxiety and disturbed sleep, according to studies looking at the connection between the SIP1A2 genotype and caffeine effects. Additionally, when they consume caffeine, their heart rate and blood pressure rise more than other cardiovascular parameters. Conversely, rapid metabolizers exhibit less pronounced effects. Overall, there are fewer dangers and advantages. The way that various persons experience caffeine dependence is also influenced by this genetic variance. Higher caffeine accumulation speeds up tolerance development and causes more severe withdrawal symptoms in slow metabolizers. Caffeine tolerance develops more slowly, and withdrawal symptoms are less severe for rapid metabolizers who never amass as much of it. Caffeine reaction is also influenced by other genetic differences. Your adenosine receptors' sensitivity to adenosine and their propensity to upregulate in response to long-term caffeine consumption are both influenced by variations in the genes encoding these receptors. Your reward system's susceptibility to the dopamine effects of coffee is influenced by variations in dopamine receptor genes. Some people are inherently more focused and alert due to genetic variances. Since their baseline is already high, caffeine has less of an impact on these individuals. Others' baseline level of attentiveness is inherently lower. Caffeine results in a more noticeable improvement for them. Age affects caffeine reaction, in addition to heredity. Compared to younger adults, older persons have a slower metabolism of caffeine. Caffeine may have more potent and enduring effects on the elderly. Caffeine metabolism is also significantly slowed during pregnancy. Caffeine is metabolized roughly twice as slowly by pregnant women as by non-pregnant ones. For this reason, medical associations advise pregnant women to limit their caffeine intake. In pregnant women, the same dose results in longer duration and higher peak levels. The metabolism of caffeine is also impacted by medications. Caffeine metabolism is slowed by birth control pills, some antidepressants, and other drugs. It's possible that the medication is interfering with your CYP1A enzyme if you start taking it, and then notice that caffeine affects you more strongly. The metabolism of caffeine varies throughout the day as well. This may sound odd, but your body uses circadian rhythms to produce metabolic enzymes. Compared to lunchtime, CYP1A2 production is higher in the morning and evening. This implies that the same quantity of caffeine will be metabolized at varying rates depending on the time of day. The way that various persons experience caffeine dependence is also influenced by this genetic variance. Higher caffeine accumulation speeds up tolerance development and causes more severe withdrawal symptoms in slow metabolizers. Caffeine tolerance develops more slowly, and withdrawal symptoms are less severe for rapid metabolizers who never amass as much of it. Caffeine reaction is also influenced by other genetic differences. Your adenosine receptors' sensitivity to adenosine and their propensity to upregulate in response to long-term caffeine consumption are both influenced by variations in the genes encoding these receptors. Your reward system's susceptibility to the dopamine effects of coffee is influenced by variations in dopamine receptor genes. Some people are inherently more focused and alert due to genetic variances. Since their baseline is already high, caffeine has less of an impact on these individuals. Others' baseline level of attentiveness is inherently lower. Caffeine results in a more noticeable improvement for them. Age affects caffeine reaction in addition to heredity. Compared to younger adults, older persons have a slower metabolism of caffeine. Caffeine may have more potent and enduring effects on the elderly. Caffeine metabolism is also significantly slowed during pregnancy. Caffeine is metabolized roughly twice as slowly by pregnant women as by non-pregnant ones. For this reason, medical associations advise pregnant women to limit their caffeine intake. In pregnant women, the same dose results in longer duration and higher peak levels. The metabolism of caffeine is also impacted by medications. Caffeine metabolism is slowed by birth control pills, some antidepressants, and other drugs. It's possible that the medication is interfering with your CYP1A enzyme if you start taking it, and then notice that caffeine affects you more strongly. The metabolism of caffeine varies throughout the day as well. This may sound odd, but your body uses circadian rhythms to produce metabolic enzymes. Compared to lunchtime, CYP1A2 production is higher in the morning and evening. This implies that the same quantity of caffeine will be metabolized at varying rates depending on the time of day. Compared to caffeine taken around midday, caffeine taken in the morning is digested more quickly. Gender-related variations in caffeine sensitivity also exist. According to certain research, women are more susceptible to the negative effects of coffee than males are, exhibiting higher levels of anxiety and disturbed sleep. The evidence supporting this claim is conflicting, though, and a large portion of what we see might be the result of variations in body weight, and the amount of coffee consumed per unit of body weight, rather than actual gender differences in sensitivity. Stress level affects how you feel caffeine. During times of extreme stress, you produce more cortisol and adrenaline. Caffeine enhances these stress hormones. For someone already in a condition of high stress, caffeine can convert background worry into full-blown panic. Conversely, for someone with a low stress level, caffeine is just stimulating and focusing. Emotional condition influences caffeine reaction as well. If you are already experiencing depression or low mood, caffeine might help by enhancing dopamine signaling and raising mood slightly. If you are already experiencing anxiety, caffeine can worsen the anxiety by preventing adenosine's natural anxiety dampening effects and by boosting heart rate and physiological alertness. Even your microbiome affects caffeine metabolism. The metabolites and enzymes produced by the microorganisms in your stomach have an impact on how caffeine is metabolized. People who have diverse gut bacterial compositions react differently to caffeine, according to recent studies. Your varied reactions to medications are influenced by the diversity of your microbiome. Each person has a different profile of caffeine sensitivity due to a combination of genetic, physiological, psychological, and environmental factors. For this reason, a generalization on the effects of caffeine is not feasible. In certain circumstances, the claim that caffeine increases focus is accurate for many people, while it is untrue for others. For many people, the claim that caffeine interferes with sleep is accurate. For others, it is not. For some people, caffeine makes them more anxious, but not for others. Anyone considering their own caffeine consumption needs to be aware of this individualism. Understanding the general effects of caffeine is insufficient. You must know what it does to you in particular. This calls for close observation and candor regarding your personal experience. It necessitates differentiating between expected and actual experiences, as well as between placebo and real effects. To forecast how you will react, you must have a thorough understanding of your own personality, metabolism, and genetics. Beyond the brain, the body reacts. Caffeine has important effects all over the body, but the majority of its actions are in the brain due to adenosine receptor blockage. Although these effects are less obvious than those in the brain, they are just as significant in determining how caffeine alters your general physiology and well-being. Caffeine has one of the biggest effects on the cardiovascular system throughout the body. Adenosine acts on adenosine receptors throughout your blood vessels, causing vasodilation or blood vessel widening when your adenosine levels are high, which occurs when you are tired. Blood pressure is lowered as a result. Your body uses it as a natural window to get ready for sleep. However, this vasodilation does not happen when caffeine inhibits adenosine in all parts of your body, including your blood vessels. Blood vessels continue to be narrow, blood pressure increases, the heart rate rises. The amount of caffeine you take and your level of sensitivity determine these effects. However, even in those who do not subjectively notice them, they are genuine and quantifiable. Caffeine's effects on the heart can be severe enough to be medically alarming for those who already have high blood pressure or heart disease. Even a brief increase in heart rate or blood pressure might cause angina or arrhythmias in vulnerable people. For this reason, cardiologists frequently advise their patients with cardiac problems to cut back on caffeine. Caffeine's brief elevation of blood pressure and heart rate is typically harmless for young, healthy individuals. However, it is important to remember that over time, a persistent increase in these cardiovascular indicators is linked to a higher risk of heart disease. If you consume caffeine on a regular basis, your heart rate and blood pressure will remain elevated. This may increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, even if the increase is slight over decades. Your kidneys are also impacted by caffeine. When adenosine builds up, it causes your kidneys vasoconstriction, which lowers kidney blood flow and has a mild antidiuretic effect. In other words, adenosine aids in water retention. Caffeine reverses this impact by blocking adenosine in the kidneys. Your kidneys produce more urine and slightly increase blood flow. Caffeine is a moderate diuretic because of this. Caffeine's diuretic effect is frequently overstated too. Similar to how regular caffeine users become tolerant of the alerting effect, they also become tolerant of the diuretic impact. Even if you continue to use caffeine, you stop experiencing increased urination after a few days of use. Because of this, the widely held notion that caffeinated beverages shouldn't be included in your daily fluid intake is not entirely accurate. Although caffeine has a slight diuretic effect, it wears off quickly with frequent usage. Additionally, caffeine promotes the release of stress chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol. Caffeine's effects on the brain mediate this indirect effect. Your sympathetic nervous system, often known as the fight or flight system, is stimulated by the elevated alertness and arousal that caffeine creates. Even if you are just sitting at your desk sipping coffee, your body releases hormones as though you are under stress. There are repercussions from this stress hormone production. It is usually benign and even helpful in the near run. Adrenaline and cortisol give you more energy, sharpen your focus, and prime your body for action. However, long-term coffee consumption causes these stress hormones to be released more often. Chronic stress hormone increase causes serious long-term health effects. It makes your entire body more irritated. It weakens the immune system, making a person more vulnerable to illnesses. It may contribute to metabolic dysfunction by altering the metabolism of glucose. It promotes abdominal obesity by changing the distribution of fat. It may contribute to osteoporosis by altering bone metabolism. Elevation of stress hormones over time is linked to a higher risk of anxiety, depression, and cognitive deterioration. This indicates that although caffeine may seem like a useful tool for reducing fatigue and enhancing performance, it has a metabolic cost, particularly when used frequently and persistently. Your digestive system is also impacted by caffeine. It causes your digestive tract to contract more forcefully and promotes the production of stomach acid. This can be advantageous for certain individuals. Constipation can be alleviated and digestion enhanced by caffeine. Caffeine can worsen symptoms for certain people, particularly those who have ulcers or acid reflux. The esophagus or stomach lining may get irritated by the increased stomach acid, and those who suffer from irritable bowel syndrome may experience symptoms due to the increased intestinal contractions. Your skeleton is also impacted by caffeine. Frequent caffeine use marginally increases the excretion of calcium through the urine. If you get enough calcium from your food, this won't necessarily cause bone loss. However, if you drink a lot of coffee over decades, you may lose more calcium, which can lead to osteoporosis, especially if you have a hereditary susceptibility to the condition or a minimal calcium intake. Additionally, caffeine affects body temperature. Caffeine causes the release of stress hormones, which raise your metabolic rate and slightly increase the amount of heat you produce. Caffeine is occasionally included in weight loss pills for this reason. It raises energy use a little bit, but for a few hours after consumption, the effect is minimal, usually only raising calorie burn by around 5%. Without further food and exercise modifications, this is insufficient to result in noticeable weight loss. Your eyes are one area of the body where coffee has a very intriguing effect. Because caffeine narrows blood vessels in the eyes, it somewhat lowers blood flow to the eyes. Because decreased blood flow results in less light scattering in the eye, this can enhance visual acuity for certain tasks. However, among those who have glaucoma or are at risk for developing it, it also raises intraocular pressure. Heavy caffeine use may possibly raise the risk of glaucoma in those who have these illnesses. Additionally, caffeine has broader effects on your endocrine system. It has intricate effects on the release of reproductive hormones. Although the evidence is conflicting and frequently muddled by other lifestyle factors, some studies have suggested that excessive caffeine consumption may have an impact on fertility. Although the effects of caffeine on thyroid function are generally mild, the exact mechanisms behind these effects are yet unknown. Caffeine's effects on the entire body serve as a reminder that the brain is not an isolated organ. Drugs like caffeine have an impact on your entire body, not just your ideas and consciousness. It alters your hormones, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, temperature regulation, and bone metabolism. Your physiology is intricately linked to the caffeine you consume. Caffeine sensitivity's progression from childhood to old age. The effects of caffeine on human neurology vary with age. Caffeine has varying effects at different ages. Thus, what is a suitable dosage for an adult may not be suitable for a youngster or an elderly person. Caffeine has practically no place in infancy. Pediatricians advise parents to refrain from giving their infants caffeinated drinks because babies do not naturally consume caffeine. Babies cannot effectively metabolize caffeine since their metabolic systems are still developing. More significantly, adenosine's effects are especially significant during the fast brain growth that infants are still experiencing. Because it encourages the creation of connections between neurons and the removal of superfluous ones, adenosine is essential for brain development. It is potentially possible to disrupt normal brain growth by blocking adenosine with caffeine during this crucial embryonic stage. Caffeine is still absent from the diets of the majority of young children. Young children regulate their degree of alertness through high levels of physical activity and their normal sleep cycles. They have a robust circadian clock, therefore they don't require caffeine. They often engage in greater physical activity than adults do, and their adenosine control is normal. However, something changes with adolescence. Teens frequently begin consuming caffeine through tea, coffee, energy drinks, and sodas. Due to early school start times that interfere with teens' normal circadian cycles, which change later in adolescence, sleep debt also frequently builds at this time. Chronic caffeine use and chronic sleep deprivation are frequently accelerated by the combination of caffeine and sleep debt, which is used to offset the fatigue caused by sleep deficit. The teenage brain is still growing during adolescence, especially the prefrontal cortex and the systems that control mood, impulse control, and decision-making. Caffeine can impede this growth by inhibiting adenosine and interfering with circadian rhythms. According to studies, teens who use large amounts of caffeine had higher rates of anxiety, disturbed sleep, and behavioral issues than teens who don't use caffeine. Adolescence's cycle of caffeine sleep deprivation can create habits that last into adulthood. Adolescents who become dependent on caffeine during these years frequently continue to do so, developing a chronic dependence on caffeine to sustain their baseline functioning. Caffeine consumption tends to peak in young adulthood. Young individuals juggle their social lives, jobs, school, and frequently little sleep. One technique for addressing this imbalance is caffeine. Since young adults' brains are already completely matured, there is less reason to be concerned about neurotoxicity interfering with development. Although it won't reach complete development until the middle of 2022, the prefrontal cortex is already grown. Caffeine is most effective and, in general, the safest throughout this time of life. The entire set of adenosine receptors and metabolic processes necessary to handle caffeine are present in the mature brain. Generally speaking, young adults can handle rather high caffeine intakes without experiencing major negative health effects. The patterns of caffeine dependence and the cascading effects of caffeine on sleep quality, however, are established in young adulthood. During this time, caffeine usage frequently establishes tendencies that last a lifetime. The tale gets more complicated around middle age. As people age, their metabolism of caffeine slows down. In young adulthood, what seemed like a moderate dosage starts to have more potent effects. As people age, their sleep quality frequently declines, and caffeine's effects on sleep disruption intensify. Hormonal changes during menopause and perimenopause may cause women to become more sensitive to coffee. In addition, many middle-aged individuals have developed chronic caffeine dependence as a result of years of caffeine consumption. Caffeine is necessary for them to operate at their baseline. When you quit caffeine, you experience unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. Continuous coffee use leads to health issues by maintaining a chronic stress hormone increase. People in their middle years are more likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease, metabolic malfunction, and cognitive loss. Caffeine sensitivity rises even more as people age. Caffeine is metabolized by less effective enzyme systems. Caffeine builds up to greater amounts. The effects of caffeine on sleep become more severe. Caffeine in the afternoon keeps many older adults from falling asleep at all that night. However, older adults frequently suffer from health issues that caffeine aggravates. Caffeine can cause heart palpitations, and atrial fibrillation is increasingly common as people age. Caffeine increases the prevalence of high blood pressure. Caffeine leads to the increase in osteoporosis. Caffeine increases the prevalence of anxiety and depression and exacerbates both conditions. Many senior citizens say that cutting back on or giving up coffee enhances their general well-being, stabilizes their cardiac rhythm, improves their sleep, and lowers their anxiety. However, because they have grown reliant on it, many also find it extremely difficult to quit. Additionally, despite the evidence to the contrary, many people mistakenly think that caffeine no longer affects them. Caffeine consumption seems to follow a regular trend throughout life. Use was non-existent during childhood, increased during adolescence and early adulthood, peaked in early to middle adulthood, and frequently remained high in older adulthood despite growing adverse effects. This trend is not inescapable. Some people understand the detrimental effects of caffeine and cut back on their intake, while others consume it moderately throughout their lives. However, it is typical. Architecture of sleep. How coffee changes the structure of your brain at night. Sleep is a complicated cycle of various sleep stages rather than a single state. Each has a unique neurochemistry, patterns of brain activity, and functions. Caffeine does not cause sleep disturbances at random. It does this in precise ways that change specific components of the organization of sleep. In humans, sleep cycles last 90 minutes on average. You go through light sleep stages 1 and 2, deep sleep stage 3, also known as slow-wave sleep, and REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, which is when most dreams happen inside each cycle. 4 to 6 full cycles occur throughout a normal sleep cycle. Every sleep stage serves a vital purpose. Your transition from wakefulness to sleep is facilitated by light slumber. Physical recovery, growth hormone release, and the consolidation of daytime memories into long-term storage all take place during deep sleep. Emotional memories are processed during REM sleep, when the brain is very active even if the body is immobilized, and when dreams happen. These periods may be crucial for creativity and emotional control. Adenosine gradually facilitates the transition to sleep, especially deep sleep, as it builds up over the day. The stage of sleep that is most directly influenced by adenosine buildup and sleep pressure is deep sleep. Your slow-wave sleep tends to be deeper and more consolidated the more adenosine you take. Caffeine lowers sleep pressure and makes it more difficult to fall asleep by blocking adenosine. However, if you are able to fall asleep, caffeine can also change the way your sleep is structured. Despite the caffeine, those who drink it in the afternoon or evening frequently discover that their sleep is less deep when they do fall asleep. There is less slow-wave sleep, which ought to be centered in the early hours of the night. Caffeine also frequently affects REM sleep. Because caffeine suppresses REM sleep, when the caffeine is eventually removed or wears off, there is a greater REM sleep rebound. This is one of the reasons why abruptly stopping coffee frequently causes vivid dreams or even nightmares. The brain is creating more REM sleep to make up for the suppression of REM sleep. Caffeine's structural alterations to sleep have repercussions. Less physical recovery, less motor memory consolidation, and less growth hormone release result from lack of deep sleep. Lack of REM sleep reduces the brain's capacity for creative consolidation processes, emotional memory consolidation, and emotional control. Chronic caffeine use that results in shallow or disturbed sleep over time may be a contributing factor to cognitive deterioration. The brain's glymphatic system, which eliminates metabolic waste products that build up during waking, is at its most active during sleep. This cleaning works less well if your sleep is shallow or disturbed. Lack of sleep makes it easier for amyloid beta and 2 proteins linked to Alzheimer's disease to build up. Actually, one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is persistent sleep deprivation, and caffeine may play a significant role in long-term cognitive health due to its sleep-disturbing effects. Sleep latency is another significant component of sleep architecture that is impacted by coffee. How long does it take to get to sleep? Sleep delay is increased by caffeine. You may discover that it takes 45 minutes or more to fall asleep if you typically doze off after 15 minutes of going to bed but consumed caffeine in the afternoon. This may not seem like much, but it's just another way that caffeine is interfering with the adenosine signal that should be lulling you to sleep. Additionally, caffeine tends to increase the frequency of short sleep awakenings. In the eyes of your conscious recollection, you may sleep through the night. Even though you don't recall waking up, your brain's EEG readings would reveal several short arousals over the night. Your ability to get the deep, restorative sleep that necessitates uninterrupted, prolonged slumber is disrupted by these micro-awakenings. The association between caffeine use and REM behavior disorder, a condition in which individuals physically act out their dreams rather than having the typical sleep paralysis that accompanies REM sleep, has been the subject of some of the most intriguing studies on coffee and sleep. Caffeine's effects on REM sleep may be so profound that they change the motor control systems that typically paralyze you during REM sleep, as heavy caffeine users may exhibit elevated signs of REM behavior disorder. Caffeine has a metabolic cost at night, even if it helps you stay up later or feel more alert throughout the day because of all these effects on sleep architecture. Your sleep is less restorative, more fragmented and shallower. This can eventually lead to chronic sleep deprivation, which has serious repercussions for immune system function, metabolic health, emotional control, and cognitive performance. The paradox of dependence, compensating while feeling normal. Chronic caffeine users frequently report feeling normal while using the drug and awful when they stop, which is one of the most pernicious effects of chronic caffeine use. This provides a strong incentive to keep using caffeine, even when it is obviously not beneficial to the user. It is necessary to comprehend how the brain adjusts to long-term drug usage in order to comprehend this paradox. As we previously explained, consistent caffeine usage causes your brain to adjust by upregulating adenosine receptors. However, Basic receptor alterations are only one aspect of the brain's adaptability. It entails alterations in baseline neurochemistry, gene expression, and neural network reorganization. Your baseline level of adenosine receptor activation varies over the course of weeks or months of regular caffeine consumption. The regulatory systems in your brain adjust to the ongoing adenosine blockage. When you consume coffee on a regular basis, the network of adaptations grows so large that you begin to feel as though the chemistry of your brain is normal. This is your baseline brain on caffeine. On the other hand, after months of persistently inhibited adenosine, your brain feels strange when you don't have caffeine. Strong adenosine signals are now being delivered to all of those increased adenosine receptors without caffeine's interference. The baseline condition is uncomfortable, akin to exhaustion or dysfunction. This produces what addiction specialists refer to as feeling compensated, even though this was your initial baseline before you ever started consuming caffeine. While experiencing pharmacologically changed neurology, the chronic coffee consumer feels normal. When they are in their original unaffected state, they experience impairment. What they consider normal has changed. Because of this, people who quit using caffeine after years of regular use frequently feel as though something is very wrong with them. For 1 or 2 weeks, they experience withdrawal symptoms, which make them feel more exhausted and less able to concentrate than they did before they started taking caffeine. Unaware that they only require caffeine to function at the level that long-term caffeine use has made them feel normal, a level beyond their true baseline, they may take this as proof that they require caffeine to function correctly. If they continued through the withdrawal for several weeks, their adenosine receptors would gradually normalize. Their adenosine signaling would revert to baseline. Without caffeine, their baseline level of focus and alertness would actually be higher than what they experienced throughout the adaptation phase while using caffeine. However, the majority of people do not stick with withdrawal since the pain is genuine and the desire to feel awful is a strong incentive to resume caffeine usage in order to alleviate the suffering. Awareness of caffeine dependence requires an awareness of this dynamic, in which the adapted state feels normal, the original condition feels dysfunctional, and the transition between them feels like a decline toward incapacity. This explains why people keep taking caffeine even after they are aware that it is making it harder for them to sleep or making them more anxious. They persist because, at least temporarily, abstaining from coffee feels worse. This is also the reason it's so hard to kick caffeine addiction on your own. It involves more than simply discipline and willpower. It's about the real restructuring of your brain around caffeine, without you knowing what's going on or anticipating the withdrawal without any help. Within a few days, the majority of people resume their caffeine use. This occurrence has an intriguing corollary. According to some studies, even after quitting for months or years, chronic caffeine users never completely regain their pre-caffeine baseline. Some of them may last for a long time or even forever, including alterations in adenosine receptor density, restructuring of brain pathways, and changes in gene expression. This implies that even years after quitting coffee, a person who used it heavily for years may have a greater baseline adenosine receptor density. They may be more susceptible to adenosine signaling by nature. Alternatively, people may discover that the effects of caffeine are stronger when they resume after years of abstinence. Chronic drug exposure leaves a memory in the brain that is difficult to forget. Coffee consumption and mental wellness. Caffeine and mental health have a complicated and reciprocal interaction when a stimulant turns into a stressor. In some situations, caffeine can enhance mood and mental performance, yet in other situations it might worsen mental health issues, especially anxiety and sadness. We must acknowledge that caffeine is essentially a stimulant of the central nervous system in order to comprehend this relationship. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are raised, alertness is increased, and the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Some people may find these effects pleasant, especially those who struggle with depression-related lethargy or have a naturally low baseline arousal. Caffeine can offer short-term assistance to someone suffering from depression who exhibits low mood, low energy, and low motivation. A small improvement in mood can result from reward networks' increased dopamine signaling. The rise in arousal can help fight off indifference and exhaustion. Focus and attentiveness can be improved by the elevated norepinephrine. In these ways, caffeine can improve the very neurotransmitter systems that are dysregulated in depression, acting almost as a moderate antidepressant. This contributes to the high rate of caffeine usage among depressed individuals. At least temporarily, it is beneficial. It offers a conveniently available, socially acceptable, and lawful method of self-medication. However, this self-medication has a catch. The mood-altering effects of caffeine are transient. Tolerance to the mood-boosting benefits of caffeine develops when your brain adjusts to long-term use, just as it does to the alerting effects. What used to greatly improve your mood is becoming less and less helpful. The brain changes brought on by long-term caffeine consumption are still ongoing. Your dopaminergic system starts to malfunction. In fact, without caffeine, your baseline mood gradually declines. When people use coffee as a self-medication for depression, they frequently end up needing it to go back to where they were before drinking. With the ongoing fear that quitting caffeine may return them to their initial baseline or worse, they have exchanged their initial depressed baseline for a somewhat less depressed baseline, while still being caffeine dependent. When anxiety and coffee combine, the situation becomes even more complex. Caffeine frequently makes anxiety worse, even while it can help with depression-related apathy and low mood. Caffeine inhibits the natural dampening of fear and anxiety signals that adenosine offers by inhibiting adenosine in the amygdala and other areas involved in anxiety processing. Caffeine can greatly increase anxiety in people who are already prone to it. Caffeine's physical effects, which include elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, and increased muscle tension, also resemble the outward manifestations of worry. These physical symptoms can set off a feedback cycle for an anxious person. Physical arousal is brought on by caffeine. Anxiety is felt as physical arousal, which in turn leads to increased anxiety, which in turn leads to more physical arousal. This pattern may intensify into a panic attack. For those who are already hypervigilant to physical stimuli, such as those with social anxiety disorder or panic disorder, this is especially difficult. Caffeine is frequently a potent anxiety trigger for some people. When we take into account that the disturbance of sleep that caffeine induces is also a state that promotes anxiety, the relationship between caffeine and anxiety becomes even more complex. Sleep deprivation impairs emotional regulation and raises emotional reactivity. Lack of sleep causes the same circuitry that handles anxiety and fear to become hypersensitive. Therefore, caffeine raises baseline anxiety by interfering with sleep. The individual then experiences fatigue and anxiety the following day. In order to feel alert, they increase their caffeine intake. However, this causes further sleep disturbances, which exacerbates worry. The cycle starts to reinforce itself. For many people with anxiety, just cutting off caffeine significantly reduces their symptoms. When coffee is eliminated, anxiety that looked uncontrollable and was ascribed to neuroticism, their basic personality, or their hereditary susceptibility to anxiety frequently significantly improves or goes away completely. This is because long-term caffeine usage was greatly aggravating the underlying anxiety disorder not because caffeine caused it. Additionally, caffeine has significant interactions with bipolar disorder. Coffee can cause manic or hypomanic episodes in bipolar disorder sufferers. Caffeine's stimulant impact, which raises dopamine and norepinephrine, can cause mania in someone who is susceptible to it. For this reason, a lot of doctors particularly recommend that bipolar patients avoid caffeine. In a similar vein, caffeine and ADHD have a complicated interaction. Because caffeine's dopamine-related effects roughly mimic those of ADHD drugs, such as stimulant amphetamines, some persons with ADHD utilize it as a kind of self-medication. Caffeine can really improve focus and impulsive control for these people. Caffeine, however, tends to exacerbate symptoms for some ADHD sufferers. It can decrease sustained concentration and promote hyperactivity and impulsivity. This variation is related to individual differences in baseline and sensitivity of the dopamine system once more. Heterogeneous dopamine dysregulation is a feature of ADHD. Caffeine's dopamine surge helps some people. For others, it causes excessive dopamine signaling, which exacerbates symptoms of ADHD. For those who suffer from schizophrenia or other psychotic illnesses, the relationship between caffeine and psychotic disorders is also significant. In general, caffeine is not advised. Caffeine's stimulant effects can worsen psychotic symptoms by raising paranoia and intensifying hallucinations or delusions. Additionally, as sleep disturbance is a known trigger for psychotic episodes, caffeine's effects on sleep can be especially problematic for those with psychotic disorders. Chronic caffeine consumption has effects on mood and anxiety in the general population that are frequently overlooked or not directly linked to caffeine, even outside of specific mental health diagnoses. Many people don't realize how much their regular coffee intake contributes to their persistent low-grade anxiety, irritation, or mood instability. Dopamine and other monoamine neurotransmitter systems are downregulated in some ways and upregulated in others as the brain adjusts to long-term caffeine use. After months of consistent use, the baseline emotional state without caffeine is frequently worse than it was prior to the onset of caffeine use. Caffeine causes a dopamine boost that you become accustomed to, making everyday tasks seem less interesting, rewarding, and worthwhile. Your general mood declines. This decreased mood causes your baseline anxiety to rise. For this reason, those who successfully quit using caffeine after years of use frequently report a significant improvement in their general mood. Their baseline mood over the course of days and weeks, not just their acute mood when abstaining from caffeine. The world seems more interesting. Activities seem more fulfilling. Emotions that are positive seem easier to access. The presence of anxiety diminishes. After quitting caffeine, it usually takes 2 to 4 weeks for the acute withdrawal to subside and for baseline mood to return to its pre-caffeinated state. However, as the brain's numerous compensatory adaptations progressively return to normal, the gains frequently last for months. After experiencing how much better their mental health is without caffeine, people who survive withdrawal frequently say they cannot fathom returning to chronic use. The benefit question: is caffeine worth it? At this point in our exploration, a natural question emerges. Is caffeine beneficial or harmful? Given everything we have discussed, the tolerance that develops, the disruption to sleep and circadian rhythms, the effects on anxiety and mood, the cardiovascular effects, and the dependency, is there a case for caffeine at all? The honest answer is it depends. Caffeine is neither universally good nor universally bad. Its value depends on your individual circumstances, your genetics, your current state of health, your goals, and your ability to use it without developing problematic dependence. There are genuine scenarios where caffeine is beneficial. A person who is sleep-deprived due to circumstances beyond their control. Caring for a new baby and dealing with a temporary work crisis, one can use caffeine to maintain sufficient alertness to get through the short-term difficulty. For a student in the final days before an important exam, caffeine can enhance focus and memory formation. For a long-distance driver who is dangerously fatigued, caffeine can prevent an accident. In emergency cases where temporary wakefulness is needed, coffee is actually useful. It solves the acute problem of weariness. The key is that these are acute events, transient uses of caffeine, not chronic daily usage. There is additional evidence that moderate caffeine consumption, around 200 to 400 milligrams per day, corresponding to 2 to 4 cups of coffee, is connected with certain health advantages in the general population. Studies have identified links between moderate caffeine consumption and reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of some malignancies, reduced risk of Parkinson's disease, and enhanced cognitive performance in aging. Some studies have also revealed a J-shaped or U-shaped connection between caffeine consumption and mortality, showing that moderate use is associated with slightly decreased overall mortality compared to no consumption or high consumption. However, these epidemiological relationships need to be read carefully. They are not proof of cause and effect. People who use moderate quantities of caffeine certainly differ from people who consume no caffeine or very high amounts of caffeine in numerous ways beyond just caffeine consumption. They might exercise more, sleep better, have better genetics, have better socioeconomic standing, or have other lifestyle characteristics that enhance health. The relationship between moderate caffeine consumption and health advantages might reflect these other factors rather than being induced by the caffeine itself. Moreover, these population-level health relationships describe average impacts across populations. They do not tell us about individual consequences. An individual person might see coffee as clearly damaging, interrupting their sleep, raising their anxiety, and aggravating a cardiovascular problem, even if, on average, throughout a huge community. Moderate caffeine use is related to health advantages. We must consider this from a variety of time perspectives in order to determine whether caffeine is worthwhile. Caffeine is frequently helpful for hours to days in the short term. It enhances performance, focus, and alertness. It helps you solve a challenging problem or get through a long day. Caffeine generally makes most people feel better than when they are experiencing caffeine withdrawal. Caffeine gets increasingly unclear throughout the course of weeks to months. Yes, utilizing it makes you more concentrated and attentive, but it may also cause worry, cardiovascular tension, and disturbed sleep. The benefits and hazards trade-off becomes less obvious. For some, the trade-off is worth it. For some, the tension and disturbed sleep eventually become unbearable. The justification for caffeine weakens over the course of years or decades. The short-term advantages diminish as tolerance grows. Without the immediately apparent advantages of caffeine, you are left with reliance and require it simply to feel normal. Health issues are caused by a combination of long-term sleep disturbance, elevated stress hormones, and sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Decades of circadian rhythm disturbance may be a factor in metabolic malfunction and cognitive impairment. In their later years, many persons who consume large amounts of caffeine in their early and middle adult years fervently hope to cut back or quit. But because they have grown so reliant on it, they are unable to. Caffeine in the evening causes them to have trouble sleeping. Chronic stimulation makes them nervous and twitchy, although they feel their hearts race. The idea of going through caffeine withdrawal is unbearable. They're stuck in a routine that was set decades ago. According to this long-term viewpoint, chronic daily caffeine usage is probably going to be detrimental over the course of a lifetime, even though it might make sense for occasional acute use. The expenses mount up more quickly than the advantages. Productivity and caffeine, the real findings of the research. The idea that caffeine increases productivity is among the most common misconceptions about it. The presumption is so pervasive that it is ingrained in contemporary workplace culture. Labor agreements include provisions for coffee breaks. In offices, coffee makers are commonplace. Whole chains of coffee shops have based their business strategies on giving employees caffeine in an effort to boost productivity. However, what is the actual evidence about the impact of coffee on productivity? The situation is more nuanced than the general consensus indicates. Indeed, in some situations, caffeine can improve some aspects of productivity. As we talked about, it enhances focus and attentiveness. When performing jobs that need prolonged focus, it can enhance performance. In situations where speed is more crucial than accuracy, it can enhance performance. Caffeine's impact on productivity, however, varies greatly depending on the task and situation. Caffeine can improve performance on normal, well-practiced jobs that don't call for much imagination or critical consideration. Caffeine may help someone review texts, enter data, or complete other repetitive tasks more quickly and accurately. However, the link becomes more intricate when dealing with intricate creative problem-solving activities. Arousal and performance have an inverted U connection, as we previously discussed. For complicated jobs, a moderate level of arousal is ideal. You can't concentrate if your arousal is too low. When your arousal level is too high, your thinking becomes inflexible and stiff. Although caffeine can raise your arousal level to the ideal level, it can also cause you to become overly aroused, which constricts your thinking and prevents you from coming up with original answers. Results from studies on caffeine's effects on creativity in particular have been conflicting. According to some research, caffeine reduces creativity, especially when it comes to tasks that call for divergent thinking, which generates several potential solutions. According to other research, caffeine either doesn't affect or even improves creativity. The distinctions most likely stem from the individual differences we previously covered. The task and the individual determine the ideal level of arousal. The subject of long-term versus short-term productivity is another. Indeed, caffeine may increase your output over the next several hours. However, your productivity the next day will be lower than it would have been without the caffeine if it interferes with your sleep that night, decreasing the quality of your sleep or making you sleep for a shorter period of time. In actuality, the interruption of sleep brought on by afternoon caffeine frequently lowers productivity the next day more than it increased the day before. Chronic caffeine users frequently state that they feel more productive after using caffeine. However, they frequently find that their actual productivity is comparable to or even higher without coffee when they actually try cutting it out for a few weeks and see how they feel. There is some truth to the seeming increase in productivity. In addition to being more attentive and stimulated, they also feel different and more active, which might be confused with increased productivity. Furthermore, the kind of productivity that coffee increases is frequently not the most important kind. Working more hours at a frantic pace driven by caffeine is not the same as focusing on the most crucial tasks, considering issues carefully, and delivering high-caliber work. Actually, there is proof that when people are not highly stimulated or aroused, they produce some of their best creative and intellectual work. Rather than during times of increased productivity, many scientists, writers, and artists report that their most significant breakthroughs occur during peaceful, unstimulated periods of thought. The productivity trap with email and chat apps is comparable to the caffeine productivity trap. By dividing attention and inhibiting in-depth work, these tools frequently reduce actual productivity, even though they seem to boost it by helping you respond fast, stay active, and complete tasks. The story of caffeine, a chemical that is ingrained in society worldwide. Among psychoactive substances, caffeine is special since it is widely accessible, legal, socially acceptable, and interwoven in many ways that are not readily apparent in contemporary society. Caffeine is not usually thought of as a drug in the same category as alcohol or nicotine, much less one that is banned. Caffeine is as harmless as food or water. However, caffeine is unquestionably a drug. It is a psychotropic drug that alters behavior and consciousness. It's addictive. There are withdrawal symptoms. Depending on dosage, personal characteristics, and situation, it can have both beneficial and detrimental effects on health. We should treat it with the same utmost care as any other medication. Caffeine's widespread acceptance and normalization raise intriguing questions regarding how societies categorize medicines. The legal standing and societal acceptability of a substance may not always indicate its importance or level of hazard. They represent political choices, historical accidents, and cultural development. Because it arrived during a period of rapid industrialization and development in Europe and America in the 17th and 18th centuries, caffeine became legal and accepted in these countries. These societies found caffeine to be beneficial. During extended work shifts, it assisted employees in remaining attentive. It assisted thinkers in staying focused throughout long periods of labor. It was incorporated into modernity's cultural and economic apparatus. If caffeine had come in our times instead of the 1600s, it would undoubtedly be viewed considerably differently. Instead of being marketed as a beverage, it would most likely only be accessible with a prescription and be categorized as a drug for narcolepsy, or ADHD. It would seem evident that it should be strictly monitored given its propensity for addiction, effects on sleep, and cardiovascular effects. But because caffeine arrived centuries ago, because it became intertwined with coffee and tea cultures, and because it serves the interests of modern industrial economies, keeping workers alert and productive, it is treated not as a drug that requires careful management but as a simple beverage with minimal health relevance. Our conflicted relationship with awareness and stimulation is revealed by the global caffeine narrative. We want to be awake and alert, but we also desire rest and serenity. In a way, caffeine is a deal with modernity. Your body developed to follow a natural pattern of wakefulness and sleep, which you must give up if you want to be productive and stay awake for extended periods of time. You must constantly engage your neural system to remain ahead of the exhaustion that is the inevitable consequence of sleep disruption. This deal is made for many people without their conscious choice. You almost automatically become a caffeine user because it is so common and accepted. You don't choose to develop a psychoactive substance dependence. It just happens. One morning, you have a cup of coffee because you're exhausted. But the next morning, you feel worse without it. You have another cup then. You have already built your life around it by the time you recognize how much you rely on it. Inequalities in the world are also reflected in the global caffeine narrative. Ethiopia, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, and other emerging countries in the global south are the main producers of caffeine. Rich, developed nations in Europe, North America, and East Asia are the main consumers of it in the global north. Coffee growers and harvesters frequently earn low wages and endure harsh working conditions. The stimulation has both cognitive and economic benefits for the wealthier countries that use it. The role of caffeine in contemporary life also has a gender component. For the large number of women joining the modern workforce, caffeine has been especially crucial. Caffeine evolved and became a tool for women to cope with the unachievable demands on their time and energy as they took on both job and household duties without the domestic support networks that had previously been in place. Caffeine has been promoted to many women as a way to stay up to date in both the home and professional worlds. This hasn't been totally bad. One tool that has helped women participate more in the workforce is caffeine. However, it has also resulted in women who are disproportionately burdened with unrealistic expectations becoming reliant on stimulant drugs in order to live up to them. The expectations and situations that make caffeine seem necessary are the issue, not caffeine per se. Options and tactics for surviving in a world of coffee. What are the options, considering all we have talked about? What can someone do if they want to stay focused and awake without being dependent on caffeine? Sleep is the most obvious substitute. The most effective way to improve alertness, focus, and cognitive performance is to get enough sleep. The benefits of real sleep are far greater than those of coffee. More attentiveness the next day is produced by 8 hours of sleep than by coffee. However, sleep necessitates time, something that contemporary living makes more and more challenging. Sleep must take precedence over other obligations. To say yes to sleep, you have to say no to some possibilities. Sleep cannot be prioritized by many people, not in the immediate future anyway. Social engagements, family responsibilities, and work pressures can all make it seem impossible to get enough sleep. However, it's critical to acknowledge that sleep is necessary, and that sacrificing sleep in order to accomplish more work is ultimately detrimental. There are additional methods to improve focus and alertness besides sleep. Exercise has a very strong effect on increasing alertness. Moderate exercise for 30 minutes can provide attention and focus-boosting effects comparable to those of caffeine without the sleep-depriving side effects. Exposure to sunshine in the morning has been shown to improve alertness and assist the synchronization of the circadian cycle. Bright light exposure in the morning results in a strong boost in alertness that lasts the entire day, even in the absence of coffee. Another effective way to increase alertness is through social interaction. Social interaction, group projects, and dialogue with others. These all improve focus by triggering arousal mechanisms. Many people might work alone and feel exhausted and distracted, but when others are around, they instantly become alert. An acute arousal reaction is triggered by cold exposure, cold showers, pouring cold water on your face, or simply being in a cold environment. Although the effects of cold exposure are not as long-lasting as those of coffee, they can be useful in situations requiring sudden alertness. Contrary to popular belief, relaxation and breaks are crucial for sustaining attention and alertness. Working non-stop results in mental exhaustion and deteriorating performance. However, taking short breaks, even 5 to 10 minutes, can help you regain your mental energy and perform better during succeeding periods. Focus is also improved by organized work periods with precise objectives and progress indicators. Low motivation and wandering attention are the results of working on tasks that are not clearly defined and have no end goal. However, focusing on well-defined, attainable goals results in increased focus and longer-lasting productivity. Caffeine consumption is quicker and easier than any of these substitutes. Caffeine takes only a few seconds to start working. In addition to requiring more preparation and time, these substitutes don't have the same long-term consequences as caffeine. No worry, no reliance, no tolerance, no disturbed sleep. The ideal strategy for individuals who wish to cut back on their caffeine intake but are now reliant on it is to gradually cut back rather than stop all at once. Most people relapse when they abruptly stop using coffee because the withdrawal symptoms are so unpleasant. However, by reducing caffeine intake by 10 to 25% every few days or every week, the brain can gradually adjust, reducing the severity of withdrawal symptoms. Prioritizing sleep, exercise, and exposure to light is especially crucial during a caffeine reduction or removal process in order to make up for the loss of caffeine's alerting effects. Otherwise, the person fights through withdrawal, gets tired, and has a higher chance of relapsing. Some tactics are worth taking into consideration for those who wish to keep using caffeine while minimizing any negative effects. Sleep disturbance is reduced when coffee is consumed early in the day. Instead of consuming your caffeine throughout the day, consume most of it before 10 or 11 a.m. Caffeine decreases the development of tolerance when taken in cycles, with heavy use for 1 to 2 weeks followed by a 1 to 2 week break. Consuming caffeine with food rather than on an empty stomach minimizes the initial surge in caffeine levels and promotes a more steady rise, lowering jitteriness and adverse effects. Regular exercise, enough sleep, and morning sun exposure become much more vital if you are using coffee. They give competing sources of alertness and arousal, potentially allowing you to require less coffee. They also mitigate some of caffeine's detrimental health effects. What coffee feels like on the inside is known as its phenomenology. So far, we have been talking about caffeine from an outside, objective standpoint. How it alters sleep architecture, how it interferes with circadian rhythms, and how it functions biochemically. Nevertheless, there is also the subjective sensation of caffeine, the way it feels on the inside of the mind. Anticipation is where most people's coffee experiences start. You start to expect the effect when you see a cup of coffee or smell coffee brewing. Even before you drink the coffee, your brain begins to release dopamine in anticipation of the reward. Learning linkages between coffee and the effects of caffeine induces this physiologic anticipatory dopamine. However, it has a psychological component as well. You think drinking coffee will improve your mood. Additionally, this thinking itself alters the nervous system. The moment of consumption follows. The sensation of drinking something, the taste, the ritual, and the warmth of the cup. This practice becomes ingrained in habit patterns for frequent users. Even when the coffee is decaffeinated, many people discover that the ritual of brewing and consuming it has an impact. There is a true and substantial placebo effect. There is typically little subjective effect in the initial minutes following caffeine use. Significant amounts of caffeine have not yet entered the brain. However, depending on personal circumstances, the effects start to show within 15 to 45 minutes. The effects may be striking for infrequent or first-time users. One feels more aware, thinks more quickly, and feels as though the world is becoming clearer. A mild jitteriness, a sense of physical activation, an increase in pulse rate, and tense, action-ready muscles are common. A little feeling of euphoria or well-being may be present. Your motivation to interact with the world increases as it becomes more fascinating. The effects are usually far more subtle for long-term users. Though there is frequently not the tremendous activation or euphoria that new users feel, there is a sensation that thinking becomes clearer, concentration becomes more focused, and exhaustion fades. Rather, it feels more like things are getting back to normal and being as they ought to be. The way that caffeine affects a person differs according to what they are doing with it. Caffeine tends to increase their level of engagement when they are doing something exciting and captivating. The activity gets increasingly gratifying and captivating. Caffeine seems to make people feel more bored or stressed when they are engaged in difficult or uninteresting activities. Though not always more enjoyable, the activity gets more intense. The subjective peak of caffeine's effects occurs for many people between 30 and 45 minutes after ingestion. Following that, when caffeine is metabolized, the effects progressively diminish. Depending on each person's metabolism, the effects usually subside 3 to 5 hours after consumption. However, 8 to 10 hours later, slow metabolizers may still experience noticeable effects. The sensation is very different for those who are caffeine dependent and miss their regular caffeine intake. After days or weeks of consistent caffeine usage, there is a feeling of haze, trouble focusing, and exhaustion that appears to permeate everything. The world seems less engaging, less fascinating, and less interesting. Nothing is satisfying. It's hard to find motivation for anything. The unpleasantness of this state strongly encourages a return to caffeine. The subjective sensation of caffeine withdrawal can be extremely painful for those who are experiencing it. Headaches are frequent. Coffee and rest don't appear to be able to relieve the profound exhaustion. Mood, disruption, irritation, sorrow, and worry are common. A feeling of brain fog and trouble focusing is present, usually peaking 24 to 48 hours after the last caffeine use. These withdrawal symptoms progressively get better over the course of the next few days and weeks. Circadian rhythms also affect how caffeine is perceived subjectively throughout the day. A feeling of smooth enhancement is produced when you take caffeine in the morning, when your body is already increasing your level of wakefulness. You feel as if you are fighting against your biology when you ingest caffeine in the evening, when your body is attempting to wind down. Instead of a steady enhancement, there is a frenetic and somewhat uncomfortable activation. The most noticeable subjective change for many people occurs when they effectively cut back on their coffee use after becoming reliant on it. As we have talked about, they feel worse during the first week or two. Withdrawal is uncomfortable. However, many people report a significant change in their subjective experience about 2 to 4 weeks after ceasing, when the acute withdrawal subsides and the brain starts to recalibrate without continuous adenosine blockage. Once more, the world gets more fascinating. Activities seem more fulfilling. Compared to when they were caffeine dependent, they have more energy. They experience deeper, more restful sleep and a more balanced emotional state despite quitting caffeine. Given that it contradicts the long-held belief, this subjective change might be rather noticeable. The belief that in order to feel normal and perform effectively, people required caffeine. After going through the agony of withdrawal, it might be truly life-changing to realize that they feel better without caffeine. The biology of caffeine-free wakefulness. It's simple to assume that caffeine is necessary for being awake, that the natural forces of sleep pressure and exhaustion need to be actively fought with stimulants. However, this is not totally true. Both sleep and wakefulness are active states that are maintained by intricate neural networks. Caffeine does not have to keep you awake and attentive. If there is enough novelty, stimulus, and drive for your brain, you can remain up all night. Simply said, caffeine facilitates and eases prolonged wakefulness. The adenosine system is only one of several neurotransmitters and brain networks that operate to support wakefulness. An active signal for alertness and wakefulness is produced by the norepinephrine-producing locus coeruleus. Arousal is supported by the dorsal raphe nucleus and other areas that produce serotonin. The hypothalamic orexin system, which generates orexin, also known as hypocretin, is essential for sustaining alertness during the day. By producing circadian signals, the suprachiasmatic nucleus promotes both daytime alertness and nighttime sleep. Even in the absence of caffeine, all of these systems are active throughout regular wakefulness. They keep you awake and involved with the outside world. Wakefulness is not something that caffeine produces on its own. By eliminating the inhibitory effect of adenosine, it improves the wakefulness-promoting systems that are already in place. This implies that you can effectively activate your natural wakefulness systems without the need for caffeine if you get enough sleep, maintain a healthy circadian rhythm, are interested in what you're doing, are physically active, and are social. The issue is that these conditions are frequently absent from modern life. Numerous people suffer from sleep deprivation, circadian disruption, boredom, sedentary lifestyles, and loneliness. Natural wakefulness processes are not sufficiently triggered under these circumstances to sustain the degree of attentiveness demanded by contemporary needs. Caffeine becomes attractive at this point. When natural conditions are insufficient to trigger wakefulness, it does so artificially. Caffeine, however, is like using stimulants to run a sprint when you haven't eaten or slept if you rely on it while experiencing circadian disturbance, lack of engagement, and inadequate sleep. Although your systems will be more depleted, it works in the short term. Addressing the underlying conditions is the preferred course of action. Obtaining enough sleep, regulating your circadian cycle, doing things that spark your enthusiasm and drive, exercising and preserving relationships with others. Your natural wakefulness systems function well under these circumstances, allowing you to stay aware without the need for coffee. The future of biotechnology, change, attitudes, and caffeine. Caffeine's place in human life is probably going to shift as we move forward. This could be influenced by a number of variables. First, the effects of caffeine are becoming more widely recognized in science. The public's perception of caffeine's effects on sleep, circadian rhythm, anxiety, and long-term health is gradually changing as more study is conducted on these topics. A growing number of people are realizing that the caffeine they need to get through the afternoon is also the thing that keeps them from getting a good night's sleep, which makes it harder for them to function properly the following day. This knowledge could result in a shift in perceptions and actions about caffeine consumption. Biotechnology is the second. Scientists are creating novel substances that may have some of the alerting benefits of coffee without some of its drawbacks. Some substances selectively block some adenosine receptors while leaving others unaltered, which may result in focused alertness without the negative effects on the heart or anxiety. There are substances that arouse without causing as much sleep disturbance as coffee. It is uncertain if these substances will eventually be created, authorized, and utilized extensively, but it is a possibility. Third, the culture of the workplace is evolving. Some businesses are starting to realize that employees who are constantly sleep-deprived and hooked on caffeine are not the most productive. Alternative work arrangements that promote greater circadian alignment and more sleep are being investigated. Reduced work hours, flexible scheduling, and remote work are becoming more popular, especially in the wake of the pandemic's disruptions. The structural requirement for caffeine consumption in traditional work settings may be lessened by these modifications. Fourth, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and other contemplative techniques that can improve mental clarity and alertness without the need for medications are gaining popularity. Regular meditation may be a more sustainable method of improving cognitive performance than long-term caffeine use, according to some groups. It's difficult to say if these developments will significantly alter the place of caffeine in society. Too many individuals have used caffeine for too long for it to go away. However, we might shift toward more deliberate and moderate caffeine consumption, not using it every day out of dependence, but only sometimes when it is truly helpful.